welcome. Second week of the YouTube adventure that is People's History. So glad to join you today. I'm really excited to be here. So we're going to be talking today about economic transformations, and we're looking at the period of 1450 to 1750. So during this time period, we really saw a huge shift in the consumer goods that were purchased. You saw a huge shift in how those goods were produced and how they were acquired. So the European growth that took place in the Americas was kind of an accidental thing. They weren't sure exactly what was going to be there when they started looking for it. However, when you talk about Southeast Asia and Asia in general, that was very, very deliberate. And it kind of began with the Portuguese and Da Gama's voyage into India, entering into the spice market as a very, very deliberate method of like how they were going to get into the spice market. But the way that the Portuguese went about that was a lot different from, say, the Dutch or the English. So we're going to get into that a little bit. I'm super excited to be here today. I have my Jack Skellington mug. I'm ready for Halloween. Kind of just getting ready for it. So, all right. So the motivation to enter into the Indian Ocean trade was mostly like cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and pepper. Pepper was one of the biggest things for them. For example, the English thought it had a lot of medicinal purposes, and so they really, really were into it after to get pepper. It was also really needed because they needed that aid after the Black Death. Oh, stupid. Well, that was an epic fail. Okay, so after the Black Death, they really needed to get some kind of economic relief, and they sought that out through mercantilism. Remember, mercantilism is the idea of let's get as much goods from the outside as we can. We also saw a growth in population, which is not helping me because this thing is being freaking stupid. All right, so the motivation to enter the Indian Ocean trade was, if we remember, the spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, mace, cloves, pepper. Also remember the amount of people that died during the Black Death and kind of the need to have an economic growth, an economic boom. That coupled with mercantilism, the idea that you must go out and acquire as many raw goods as possible. So that growth was helped by improved weapons like the use of gunpowder in cannons and the ability to tax the people, and just this overall growth of kind of an imperialistic society. The Portuguese, as I mentioned earlier, they were the first to really begin this practice. They did it a lot differently than, say, the British or the Dutch or even the Spanish. The Portuguese believed in trying to have this trading post commerce thing without having like a standing army. That was very unsuccessful. I mean, they were managed to do it for a while, but gradually as some of these other imperialistic powers came into be, they kind of forced out the Portuguese, and they became more of a carry and trade style of economy within Portugal. So they would go get the goods, trade for the goods, and then bring it all the way back to Portugal. Spain was the first one to really challenge Portugal in the region. They were able to hold it for a century or so. But after that, Spain began to challenge Portugal in that region, and most notably in the Philippines. It started with, they had small militaries in the Philippines. It was kind of segmented societies, which made it really easy for the Spanish to control that region. The proximity to China was really what was attractive for them. If you think about it, the Philippines are extremely close to China, where you can get a lot of those spices, the silks, and and the trade made it extremely fast and easy. They also had weak social structure. There wasn't one residing power. It was kind of all over the place. Lack of claims to the area. So for the most part, the takeover of the Philippines was fairly bloodless when you think about most imperialistic powers. Most imperialism saw a lot of bloodshed and war and things like that. We didn't see a lot of that in the Philippines, although there was some. And then along with that, the Spanish brought a missionary system. So they brought Christianity to the Philippines as well. And that was a method to kind of keep control over the area as well. Because you would begin that same similar system as we talked about last week with the hacienda system, keep that going in the Philippines. And the Spain was able to keep that colonial rule for about 300 years. And kind of the biggest city in the Philippines at the time was Manila. And Manila was extremely diverse, had lots of different cultures, and it was a thriving, economic, viable city where you would see all kinds of different merchants coming to Manila to trade their various goods and stuff like that. So let's talk British and Dutch. So the British and Dutch both entered after Spain. However, the British and Dutch were much bloodier when you talk about going into their colonies and creating their colonies. The Dutch were the ones that really began it, and the reason that they were so successful was because their government gave a monopoly to the Dutch Indian Trade Company, and they were extremely efficient. They had, really good infrastructure to set up that trading system. So between that, the Dutch were extremely violent. They were also looking for nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon. They focused mainly on Indonesia. They were extremely organized, as I said. They began to remove so one of the things that the Dutch would do is that they would remove the indigenous people, put in Dutch planters, and then the Dutch would bring in slaves to work that area. One such case was the Banda Islands, in which they literally took out 15,000 indigenous people, brought in Dutch planters and slaves, and began to work that area. The slaves that the Dutch did end up using were mostly from Asia in that region, but they did use other slaves in different other regions. So let's focus a tiny bit on the English. This is going to be super quick as I go through this. I've kind of tried to condense it down. I feel like last week I gave you guys way too much information, way too fast. And remember, there is no substitute for reading. We're just kind of here going through this stuff as quickly as we can. Just kind of giving you guys some background, giving you food for thoughts type of thing. So as we work through this, I want you to think about how did the economic system of mercantilism really shape colonial rule and really start to shape, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, that area, and then into the Americas as well. So let's talk a little bit about the English. English, just like the Dutch, had a monopoly on their trade system, which was the East Indian Trade Company. The English did focus primarily on India. India was controlled by the Mughals, not the Muggles, not like Harry Potter's Muggles, but they were controlled by the Mughals. And so the Mughals were able to keep the English out for quite a bit of time until their collapse. Remember, the Mughal Empire was about 20% top heavy as far as the ruling class being Islamic, where the 80% or the majority of the population was Hindu. And so eventually that kind of corroded and they fell apart. So at first the English kind of set up a similar system to the Portuguese in that they had trading outposts. The only difference is that the English, they believed that they should have military presence within that trading post. And so they were able to secure it and hold it much longer. Remember, as we move forward, England does end up gaining control in the 19th century of India completely. But at first, the Mughal Empire was able to restrict them to 3 cities. Bombay, which is now Mumbai, Calcutta, and Madras. Those are the 3 regions. And remember, the English really focused on pepper. Although they wanted the silks and the other spices, pepper was thought to have medicinal properties, to kind of help what ails you. And so they would put pepper in a lot of things when you're talking about the 17th, 18th century. And so they needed to get that in. So remember, with the English, they also did as we're just talking primarily Southeast Asia, there was not that same kind of slave labor that was used in the Americas, in India. A lot of what they gained from the Mughals, and they would have to pay the going rate until they began to control England. So as far as the Asians themselves, they didn't altogether disappear from the Indian trade system, but you would see fewer and fewer merchants. It wasn't as organized as, say, the Portuguese or the Dutch or the English. 1 second.